Merci d'être venu jusqu'à nous.
Merci Christophe, and thank you one and all, and thank you to Beatrice for inviting me here today. As you heard there, first of all, apologies for my voice. I brought Theresa May's cold with me, so if I start coughing and spluttering, I apologise for that. It was a very interesting talk, the first talk, obviously, which is about representation. My talk's more about the kind of structural elements of broadcasting in Scotland in particular, and links into the issues of diversity in a slightly different way, which is about minority language in Scotland. But I thought it would be of interest to this audience in a sense of thinking through how in other nations and in other broadcasting settings this might also be relevant, and give a particular example. So this paper addresses the need, in a sense, for public service broadcasters to rethink the place of media sport content, the media sport content economy, in a particular way, and think about how, in the age of what we might call digital plenitude, which is in my title, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, creates new opportunities and spaces for covering sport in quite creative and new ways, and can be exploited in new ways. Even in a highly competitive environment where television sports rights are characterized by exclusivity, by, in a sense, diminishing variety, which is, in a sense, what I'm referring to there is around football dominating most scheduling around sport, and increased globalization, which we all know about in terms of media and communications more broadly. And in particular, I should be talking about a recent case study produced by myself and a fellow colleague, Dr. Javier Ramon, who's at the University of Pompa Fabra in Barcelona, who came and stayed with me in Scotland for 3 months, and that's when we did the empirical research for this paper. So I'd like to thank Javier in his absence for contributing to today's research. And what we did was we studied a decade of coverage of, or nearly a decade of coverage of sports broadcasting on the minority Gaelic channel BBC Alba. BBC Alba is a kind of a shortened version for a longer Gaelic title of the channel, which I will not try and attempt because I don't speak Gaelic, but it's commonly known as BBC Alba. This research provides some kind of fascinating empirical evidence in a way to explain or to reveal how the digital media environment has transformed the nature of sports broadcasting, not just in Scotland but more broadly, and the opportunities to cover sport which reach a broader audience for minority language broadcasters, and using sport in a way to attract non-Gaelic speakers into a minority language context. So, but before I do that, I want to set out a few sort of contextual arguments about the state of contemporary television sport in the age of what I've called digital plenitude. Now that phrase comes from Australian colleagues, Brett Hutchings and David Rowe, in their book on Beyond Television Sport, where they talk about this, the shifts in the symbiotic relationship between sport and television, sport and media more broadly, from what economists would call spectrum scarcity or broadcast scarcity into an age of digital plenitude, where we've got many outlets because of digitalization and so on. And this shift in the media sport content economy can be, as well as has been kind of going on for at least 20 years or more, from the 1990s, from the privatization, deregulation of satellite and cable television into niche pay TV entities. Obviously in the UK we have Sky that have sort of pushed the boundaries on that, and around the world, again, large media organizations have done likewise and created an environment where pay TV sport has become the norm. Of course, the relationship between television and sport has already, in a sense, risen to kind of proportions where, although we've got more and more TV sport, the diversity, arguably, within that has not been as great as we might expect. In terms of highlighting three particular dimensions of this. The first one is to emphasize the importance of exclusivity of TV rights contracts and in top-flight football in particular, which has become normalized practice. So other sports saw the lucrative model of exclusive rights to football, and have, for various reasons, followed what football leagues around the world have done to try and replicate this approach. So in sports like cricket, which I know in France maybe not the biggest sport in the world, but it may become that, and who knows, with the IPL in India, it's becoming a global sport in that sense. Rugby league, rugby union, which I know is far more popular in France, and in particular, the move towards exclusive pay TV deals in these sports, which of course are more financially rewarding for the sports, but they arguably then narrow the audience somewhat. In the UK, the importance of exclusivity has driven up economic rents to TV sport as competition has developed between Sky and other multi-channel platforms such as BT Sport now, but they've seen off various other competitors in the past. And newer cash-rich incumbents like Netflix, Amazon, Google are all primed and ready to enter this marketplace the next time Premier League rights go up for sale, for example. Secondly, access to multi-channel television, in which sport as a key driver of the niche genre increased dramatically and has become the norm. For example, the success of sport as a driver of the business of Sky in the UK saw ratings for pay TV outstrip BBC and ITV ratings for the first time in 2003, following a match between Arsenal and Manchester United in terms of the audience share. And now Sky itself has reached 10 million households by 2010, and arguably is available to at least half the households in the UK at present. So from the 1990s, where Sky maybe had 100,000 to 200,000 subscribers when it started the coverage of the Premier League in 1992, we're now in an age where nearly half the households in the UK have access, if they want it, to Sky Sports. So a big sea change in the landscape of television sport. TV rights market for sport, thirdly, also reveals a marked variance in the economic value and the volume of coverage, not just between sports leagues and competitions, but also within them. So, for example, the financial gap between the elite Premier League in England and the lower leagues in England is quite cavernous. In 2016, Manchester United's turnover was £515 million, whereas the oldest professional league club, Notts County, was sold for 3.5 million with a debt of 14 million. So again, the financial disparity between the top level sport, the ones that are able to afford Romelu Lukaku, and those that or the have-nots, if you like, is widening all the time. And in terms of coverage, the televising of women's sport and women's football, for example, within that context also pales into insignificance against men's football, in spite of more visibility and more promotion of the sport by the sport itself. In terms of Scottish sport on television, there is an important context there to understand. And again, if you haven't visited Scotland or lived in Scotland, you might not understand or appreciate how this relationship works. But the proximity of Scotland to England is both a unifying and a competing context. And it's long created a unique set of complex relationships in terms of televising of sport. So the distinctiveness of Scottish leagues, for example, and I'm sure you have heard of Rangers and Celtic and the old firm rivalry in that context, as a unique selling point of Scottish football, and competitions and teams remain a source of immense cultural pride and independence. And as previous research that I've done with my colleague Raymond Boyle has shown, sport has often been a key marker of that distinctiveness in Scottish broadcasting, both on radio and then television, where Scottish audiences have been opted out of the UK network. So opt-out as a mechanism within broadcasting has existed in Scotland since the 1920s when radio began. And opt-out means basically from the main network in the schedule there'll be an hour or two of opt-out programming just for Scottish audiences. I suppose one thing to say there, historically, that would only have been seen or listened to by Scottish audiences. But again, in the age of digital plenitude, that signal can be virtually global. You know, it's online as well. So access into Scottish content, if you like, is now UK-wide, if not sometimes global. And of course, that reflects wider national cultural interests around sport. Throughout its history, sport has long had a significant role for the BBC's output on radio and TV, whether through outside broadcasts, magazine, and highlight formats, or studio discussions like this one, which is a Saturday afternoon results service, again, which is an opt-out programme on BBC Scotland, BBC One Scotland. So viewers in England and Wales will not see this, but viewers in Scotland will, and it's a tailored results service for Scottish audiences about Scottish football. In Scotland, the BBC's broader ethos and commitment to the role of sport in the nation's cultural life has also been historically important, and albeit increasingly undermined by inflated rights fees. So the premium rights to Scottish Premier League football are held by Sky and BT, not the BBC, and ever-shrinking budgets. And again, within public service remit areas, the budgets for sport have been decreasing year on year on year. So in spite of clear cultural cachet of televised sport in Scotland and for Scottish audiences, three issues regarding the coverage of Scottish sport prevail. First, the invisibility of live Scottish football in free-to-air schedules, especially of the men's national side. So again, at the weekend there and just before, Scotland obviously were still competing to trying to get to the next, the qualifying stage of the World Cup, the knockout phase or the playoff phase. But all those matches were on Sky. They weren't on the national BBC network, whereas the England games were on ITV, which were free-to-air, which is, again, a big disparity in the sense of a particular view of the importance of those games for the nation. And this has garnered consistent criticism, both from fans, in public commentators, journalists, and even within the Scottish Government, who've complained that the Scottish FA sell their rights to a pay TV broadcaster. Secondly, although international rugby is part of the BBC's portfolio of major coverage of sports rights, BBC Scotland has received a lot of criticism for its failure to pick up the rights to competitions like the Pro 12 or now the Pro 14 rugby union competition in which Glasgow Warriors play. And thirdly, the media dominance of football in Scotland per se within the popular culture of sport, both in terms of the range of coverage of sports and, again, the gender gap within coverage of sport, has left many sports at the margins of BBC Scotland's programming mix. So this is particularly stark when one considers the coverage of indigenous sports like shinty, for example. Again, I'll have an example of what that looks like. But shinty obviously is a very historic and heritage sport, if you like, within Scotland, but gets very little airtime on the main channels. BBC Alba itself, so what is that? So BBC Alba is a publicly funded television service, and it's co-run by an organisation called MG Alba, which translates as the sort of Gaelic media service for Scotland, and the BBC. So it's a unique partnership between a television service and operated under the BBC licence. It's the only kind of partnership of its kind in the UK, certainly, in that sense, that's funded by public money. Its central aim is to ensure that persons living in Scotland are provided with a wide and diverse range of high-quality programming in Gaelic, which is a minority language and a historic language within Scotland. Again, if you've ever been to Scotland, all the road signs around the nation have the Gaelic equivalent underneath them. According to recent data, only a very small proportion of Scots speak Gaelic, 1.7% of the population, so that's around about 90,000 people, aged 3 and over. So it is very much a minority language. The position of Gaelic heavily contrasts with the health of other minority languages in the UK, like Welsh, for example, or Irish Gaelic in Ireland, or Basque and Catalan in other countries. So as a minority language, it really is a minority spoken language. And part of the reason why broadcasting exists in this language is to maintain the language. So education and broadcasting really go hand in hand in maintaining people speaking and hearing this language on a daily basis. However, that doesn't diminish the cultural significance of the language itself, that it's so small. And currently, BBC Alba reaches over 700,000 viewers every week, which suggests, obviously, that if 90,000 speakers and 700,000 people watching it, that there are non-Gaelic speakers watching this channel. Through its lifespan, BBC Alba has showcased programmes of interest and value to both Gaelic and non-Gaelic speakers. And its three main kind of scheduling programme genres are documentaries, music and sport. So it uses sport in quite a direct way to engage an audience. The research I did with Javier had three kind of overarching questions, research questions. What is the volume of sports programming on the BBC, in the BBC Alba's schedules? Why is sport offered by the channel? And how does sports programming provide value for BBC Alba in terms of its cultural, economic and sporting impact? And that last question really is the most important one in a way, in terms of how something that's funded by public money in terms of the licence fee provides a broad value to the Gaelic speaking language. The research involved a content analysis of BBC Alba scheduling of sport-related programming, as well as in-depth semi-structured interviews with producers, sports broadcasters, with channel managers and commentators. From 2008, which is when the channel was launched, to 2016, BBC Alba aired over 22,000 hours of programming, of which roughly around about 15% was sports coverage in various contexts. The outlet has offered a mix between core sports such as football and rugby, which mainly is the main live broadcast of those sports, and indigenous sports which are ingrained in the cultural fabric of Scotland, such as shinty and curling. Again, I don't know, is curling a sport that they play in France, really? I'm not sure. In the winter. Obviously, the winter sport with the big granite stones. You may have seen it at the Winter Olympics. And these are the sort of staple diet of traditionally lesser covered disciplines in the coverage. But what's also interesting, what we found, is that 32 different sports were covered by BBC Alba, which is probably at least double what BBC Scotland would cover, and it's probably more than that, actually. And it also includes sports like climbing, swimming, shooting, sailing, rowing, martial arts, orienteering, and of course the Highland Games. So the breadth of sports coverage is quite startling. You're doing this simple content analysis of the scheduling reveals a very broad variety of sports coverage. It's worth noting that live programming has represented just over 1/5 of the sports content. So most of the coverage on BBC Alba of sport is recorded, including whole football matches, which are shown as live, but the whole 90 minutes. And also, what's quite apparent is the coverage of women's sport within the coverage on BBC Alba, in particular football, but also sport documentaries. And a particular production company in Scotland has blazed a trail in creating a new format, in a sense, of a sport documentary on the channel. Now, in terms of thinking about the significance of covering sport on the channel, one of the interviewees, Margaret Mary Murray, which is a classic Gaelic name. Everybody's got kind of three names in Gaelic culture. And she's the head of Gaelic Digital Service for BBC Scotland, so she's the BBC side of this BBC Alba partnership. And in the interview, she explained why football is used the way it is. And she says a significant proportion of our wider audience comes in for football. That is part of our strategy. Why would you watch Gaelic language channel if you don't have the language? The only reason you would watch it is there is something of value, of interest to you. If you're interested in Championship football in Scotland and you know that your team is going to be on BBC Alba, you are going to watch BBC Alba. And that seems obvious, but it's a kind of a key strategic point of what the channel is trying to do in its use of sport. Another dimension of BBC Alba's coverage of sport is the relatively high exposure of women's football. So in contrast to other UK sports channels and outlets, BBC Alba has given wide exposure to both the domestic women's game with the coverage of Glasgow City, who again is a kind of interesting team that's not associated with any men's team. It's a purely women's football team that reached a few years ago the quarterfinals of the Champions League. So the coverage of them, there was a documentary series about that club. They also show UEFA Women's Champions League games and the national team as well. And again, as one of the producers of that content for women's football, Margot McQuaig has said, BBC Alba has done brilliantly in being a national broadcaster that really commits to live women's sport as a strategic goal. Women's sport has been normalised, and for that to happen, people should be able to see it. So the visibility of women's football in a Gaelic-speaking broadcasting context has broadened the audience for women's football. So in terms of diversity, obviously hitting a particular mark. Another aspect of what they're trying to achieve in covering sport is connecting to sports development and culture more broadly. And the fellow who's holding the shinty stick there is a commentator called Hugh Dan McClellan, who does the commentaries both on shinty and rugby for the channel. He's got a PhD and he's an academic, so he's an interesting character altogether. But BBC Alba has given sporting organisations and governing bodies a unique value in terms of production exposure. So Hugh Dan has argued that the channel gives them eyeballs. They might not get the income, but they get the exposure, and that exposure obviously links in to the potential to get sponsorship. Even on a kind of smaller level than you might get in football, but certainly other sports can use the leverage of exposure on BBC Alba to gain economic and financial reward. And he says there are 120 children playing shinty at lunchtime in Linlithgow Academy, which is on the east side of the nation, which is not where the traditional shinty playing culture exists within Scotland. It's mainly in the West and the Highlands. He goes on to talk about a star player and so on. But in cultural terms, it's the visibility again, the normalisation that shinty is something that people can play, that it's a Scottish sport, that it's of value and so on, is very important. So to conclude, BBC Alba has proved to be a truly Scottish channel, which occupies a distinctive position within the country's sports broadcasting scenario. The research has shown that through its broad and diverse portfolio, the channel provides sports content that audiences do not get anywhere else free to air. And it's the free to air aspect of this which is really important. And also the aspect of it's a linear channel in the sort of the speak of television executives. It's linear in sense it's a broadcast channel. But of course, in this day and age, it's also available on your mobile phone, on your laptop, on your iPod and iPad and so on. So it's non-linear as well. It's on demand if you so wish. In a channel driven by cost per hour, and again, the whole channel, the budget for the channel is £80 million, which to run a television channel is minuscule. And so sport provides kind of cheap content in that context. They pay very little in rights, if anything, and it's one thing that they've not disclosed to me what rights they pay for the coverage of sport. But again, they use the leverage of being a minority language to gain access into sporting arenas. Beyond that, sports programming has proved a gateway to the Gaelic language. It's a key driver of BBC Alba's investment in the creative sector. It employs a lot of people in outside broadcasting. Again, an interesting aside on that in terms of production. The producer of football told me that in one instance, the whole of their crew, from the camera operators to the commentator to all the assistant directors, the editor, and so on, the technicians were all women. And I think that was probably the first instance in the world, I imagine, that a football match, a men's football match, was covered in its entirety by a production crew of women. So again, that idea of diversity is written into how they operate themselves. And that should not obscure that there are certain areas to address, I suppose, and the connection to grassroots sport I've mentioned is important. But the over-reliance of repeats is a problem and an issue that really needs attention and more investment. And to bridge these gaps, I suppose what I would suggest that the BBC do is think about investing more money into these areas, which is an important cultural and heritage entity in a modern broadcasting environment. Okay, thank you.